So Borderlands 4 is going to have the most ridiculous build crafting in the entirety of the franchise, but there's one new piece of this build crafting and gearing that I don't think a lot of people know much about, but we recently got some new information on this that shows us a lot more of the full picture of this, and this is going to be on Firmware, which is essentially adding in gear sets to Borderlands. Now, I think we first need a small description of this firmware. Now, firmware, again, is essentially going to be gear sets that can be rolled on some of your pieces of gear. We're going to be going over exactly what pieces this can be rolled on, but when we first learned about firmware, we thought it was only going to be able to be rolled on enhancement modifications, shield mods, and class mods. And we did get a small look at some of these, so on a couple of the enhancement mods, we got to look at these new gear sets at the bottom of the item, and these are randomly rolled, so you can get these on any rarity of item, but every item isn't going to have them, and it'll just have some name with a symbol on it and some number out of 3. And when we first learned about these, we got to see the character have 1 equipped, meaning they had 1 out of 3 of this gear set, and that was called Action Fist. And we never actually got to see what firmware does. That's pretty much still the case. We don't actually know what any of the firmware specifically does, but this character had 1 out of 3 on Action Fist. We also got to see one called Airstrike where they had 0 out of 3. So the initial information we had for this firmware is that they were just essentially adding in gear sets into the game that would be additional rolls on some of the items you're already farming. But we have recently gotten more information that massively expands the information we have on these. Now, Moxie did an interview with one of the Borderlands 4 developers, and I'll have that video linked in the description, but he asked about firmware, and we actually got some pretty interesting information from this. So first off, we got to confirm that firmware is going to be rolling on anything that is not a weapon. So that means you have 5 slots you can have firmware on. You have your rev kit, you have your ordnance slot, you have your shield mod, your class mod, and the new enhancement mods. So 5 different pieces can roll these firmware on them. And we also got it confirmed that you can have any number of this firmware and you'll still get an effect. So you would actually be able to have 1 out of 3 on 5 different pieces of firmware if you wanted to. Now, most likely they're going to make it so the scaling as you get more pieces of that set is going to be better. So most likely you'll probably want like a set of 3 and maybe like 2 additional sets, depending on how these actually work, because it could also be the case that getting 1 out of 3 enables the effect and the other 2 just upgrade it. So you may actually want to get like 5 or maybe 4 different sets of firmware. And this information is actually pretty massive because of what we just went over. You will just have a lot of variation build to build on what pieces of firmware you're actually trying to get. Now, pretty much every time the developers have talked about firmware, they talk about it as an endgame system, something that's actually really integral to the endgame, but it's not endgame specific. So my read on that is you may be able to get firmware on lower level items, but I would assume it's going to be incredibly rare, if impossible, until you get to higher levels, and then you'll start to get it more, and it's probably made to more be farmed once you're already max level. So essentially you have these 5 different gear slots that now can also roll these firmware on them. And it does seem that on any of these 5 slots, firmware is just randomly rolled on it if you get it, because we did get a look at a handful of different items that all had the same firmware roll on it, all different rarities, all different items. So it seems that firmware is just some additional random roll on top of everything else that those 5 items could have. But again, we actually haven't seen what any of this firmware does, but again, the developers are talking about it as an endgame system, so I'm presuming this firmware is actually quite strong, or at least gives you some new potent effects. But that's not all, because with all of this new footage we've gotten released, we actually got a bit of a look at the map legend going into Borderlands 4. Borderlands 4 is going to have so many more different activities and things on your map, so the map legend is actually pretty massive, but one of the sections shows us all of the different vending machines, the respec station, and everything like that. But most interestingly, and when it comes to firmware, there is something called a firmware transfer station, and I think this is pretty self-explanatory self-explanatory what this is. It seems that if you get an item with a piece of firmware on it that you want, you'll be able to transfer that firmware to another item. Now, there's a bunch of different ways this could work. I'm presuming that it's one of two ways. It's either you'll be able to transfer a firmware off of, say, one shield mod onto another shield mod. Maybe that first shield mod is also destroyed, but you're essentially just taking that firmware, that gear set, you're taking it off one item of the same slot and putting it on another. The second way I think this could work is that you can just transfer the firmware from any of those 5 items. So you could have, say, an enhancement mod that has a firmware you want, and you could go transfer that onto a shield or something. I think one of those ways is how this is actually going to work. And this is kind of a crafting system, but it does seem that the developers thought adding this additional random roll on all 5 of these items would add too much of a grind to a lot of them. Because also keep in mind, let's say you had an enhancement mod, you would have one roll of getting the actual enhancement effect you wanted. And then you would have, I think it's 3 or 4 different stat rolls that can roll on that. So that's basically just 4 different rolls to try to get the ones you actually want, which could be ridiculously rare already. But then if you take that and add on another thing, which is firmware, you could potentially never get the actual roll you want. And it would feel really bad to, say, get like a class mod and have all 3 or 4 of the stat rolls on it exactly what you want, and you don't get a firmware roll on it, or you don't get the firmware roll you want on it. It is really nice that there's going to be a transfer station. I am also assuming, based upon this, that firmware is actually going to be pretty strong, because if these were just kind of some smaller stat or power increases, there wouldn't be that big of a reason to have a transfer station for this, because it wouldn't be that big of a deal anyway. But the fact that they have a transfer station, I think these are going to be pretty strong, and I think they are probably going to be pretty unique effects. I think there's a higher chance that these are some unique effects or utility over just being like stat increases, and I do think they are going to be more endgame focused as well. So firmware is just going to be another interesting layer on top of all of the other build crafting and gearing we're going to have in Borderlands 4. We have the biggest skill trees of the entirety of the franchise, with multiple different action skills you can choose between, with tons of different passive nodes, with augments to modify your skills, with capstones to further modify your skills. We have our 4 different weapons with the licensed weapon part system that's going to add the most ridiculous amount of possibilities. Then we have the 5 other gear slots with the rev kit, the ordnance slot, your class mod, your shield mod, and your enhancement mods. All of those having a chance to give you firmware, and all of those all having their own roles and stats on them as well. So Borderlands 4 is going to have such a ridiculous amount of build creation and build possibilities that I think it's probably going to be double or more the actual possibilities of any other Borderlands game. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
Where life is cheap and guns are plentiful. You play as a vault hunter, a badass mercenary with powerful abilities called action skills.